Ladies and gentlemen, in the history of every nation, of every organization, of every project, there are moments of truth, turning points. Fiery trials through which we all must pass. The United States of America is currently commemorating the 150th anniversary of the most important turning point in our nation's history, the American Civil War. The Civil War began in April of 1861 and it raged for 4 long years, resulting in the death of more than 625,000 Americans and changing this nation in fundamental and astounding ways we are still struggling to understand. The person who is at the center of this single most transformative event in American history was one of our nation's greatest leaders, President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's leadership legacy is the topic of tonight's presentation. Now, before we begin, I'd like to review the learning objectives for tonight's presentation. Because you see, I want you, when you're driving home in your car tonight, to feel like this presentation was worth your time. I want you to feel like you walked away with something. And so, if you pay pretty close attention, you don't check your smartphone too very often, at the conclusion of this presentation, you should be able to explain how Lincoln was able to learn from his early mistakes in order to overcome his relative inexperience as an executive. You'll understand how Lincoln was able to strategically use humor to diffuse tense situations. You'll be able to explain the role of patience and humility in Lincoln's leadership style, especially with his subordinates. You'll understand how Lincoln was able to integrate absolute moral principles into his decision-making process. And you'll be able to see how Lincoln was able to use and craft public sentiment in the creation of a powerful new vision for the Northern War effort. Before we jump in and talk about Lincoln, I want to ask a very important question. And that question is this: why does history matter? After all, isn't it just a bunch of old books, dusty maps, and letters from dead people? Well, yes, it is all of that. But it's also something much more. You see, history connects us with the great leaders of the past. It's an opportunity for us to learn as leaders, because it gives us the opportunity to study them, to read their innermost thoughts, to look at the situations they faced and ask that all-important question: what would I do if I were faced with a similar situation? But you see, history is a tool for all of us to grow and learn as leaders. Well, that's fine, John, but why does Abraham Lincoln matter? Well, I submit to you that an examination of Abraham Lincoln is a study in leadership during times of great crisis. And crisis is something, frankly, that comes to every leader at some point in his or her career. I had the very great fortune a few years ago to attend the American Society for Quality Management Conference in Orlando, Florida. One of the keynote speakers there was Lieutenant General Jefferson Howell. Howell was in charge of the Lyndon Johnson Space Center in 2003. Does anybody remember what happened involving NASA in 2003? The Columbia disaster. The Columbia Space Shuttle disintegrated high above the atmosphere and all the astronauts on board died. Weeks and the months following that disaster were some of the darkest days in the history of NASA. And Howell was the leader that led his agency through those troubled times. He had this to say about leadership. He said, the day you become a leader, you begin training. Because one day, he said, I firmly believe this, you are going to be asked to guide a group of people through the valley of the shadow of death. And when that day comes, you need to be prepared. And so that's what studying great leaders like Abraham Lincoln enabled us to do, to prepare for that day. So let's take some time to study the leadership legacy of this great American icon to see how we can better prepare ourselves to become leaders. Has anybody seen the movie National Treasure? Show of hands here. Let's do some audience participation. A lot of you have, a lot of you haven't. Huh. Good movie. Well, for those of you who have not seen the movie, let me quickly summarize the plot. It seems that our founding fathers, men like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they have amassed the greatest treasure that the world has ever seen. And obviously they don't want the British to get their hands on it. So our founding fathers hide this treasure away. It's squirreled away. And they leave clues in the nation's symbols and artwork and architecture so that one day Nicolas Cage and John Boyd could follow those clues and find the treasure. Not quite sure exactly why our founding fathers wanted Boyd and Cage to find that treasure. Perhaps our founding fathers foresaw Cage's brilliant performance as Johnny Blaze in Ghost Rider. Well, National Treasure is a work of fiction. But I believe that Abraham Lincoln's leadership is a true national treasure. And just like the movie, our ancestors left clues and artwork around the city of Washington, D.C. for us to learn about this treasure. The clues are not hard to find if you know where to look. The magnificent Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the statue at the centerpiece, that is the centerpiece of this incredible monument, was created by Daniel Chester French. And it was French's intention to capture the essence of Abraham Lincoln's leadership style in this statue. You can't really see it from the picture. You have to be there in his presence, and the symbology leaps out at you. The first thing you'll notice when you visit the monument is that the statue is not gazing out blankly into the distance. It's looking at something. If you walk around to the side of that statue and take the same perspective, it leaps out at you. The Washington Monument, our nation's most enduring symbol of unity. To Daniel Chester French, this symbolized vision. So vision is the first element in Abraham Lincoln's leadership style. The next thing you'll notice is that the right hand is open. What does an open hand signify to you? What is it? Welcoming. Good. To Daniel Chester French, it symbolized compassion. Lincoln was a compassionate leader, and so compassion is the second element of Lincoln's leadership style. And finally, you'll notice the left hand is clenched in a fist. What does the clenched fist symbolize to you? To Daniel Chester French, it symbolized resolve. And so there you have it. A true national treasure, Abraham Lincoln's leadership style. Vision, compassion, resolve. For the rest of the evening, let's just take a few moments to study each one of those elements in more detail to determine what leadership principles we can glean from this study. Is that okay with you? Okay, yeah, let's do that. All right. The first one I'd like to start with is resolve, because I love that word. It's an old-fashioned word you don't hear used very often anymore. The dictionary defines it as a noun, meaning firmness of purpose. I think a lot of people think it means stubbornness or sheer determination, but it's much more than that. It's an understanding that you are on the moral high ground and that the refusal to abandon that position. It is, as Lincoln would put it in one of his speeches, that right makes might. Now, Abraham Lincoln would have a lot of opportunities throughout the Civil War where his resolve would be tested, but nothing quite as severely as the crisis of Fort Sumter. Let's talk about that for a moment. To understand the crisis of Fort Sumter, you have to understand what was happening at the country at the time. November 6th of 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected the 16th President of the United States. 6 weeks later, South Carolina officially secedes from the Union. They're not going to follow a Republican president. A few weeks later, 6 more states secede from the Union. Now, in 1860, things were a little bit different than they are now. See, the president was not inaugurated until March 4th. So you had a long 4-month transition where you had an outgoing president who was politically marginalized, lame duck, and an incoming president-elect who had not yet assumed his full constitutional powers. And so people didn't know what to do. And what you have to understand is when a state secedes from the Union, it's not a peaceful process. The very first thing that state does is it starts to seize federal property. They seize the post offices, they seize the ports, and of course they seize military forts. So, by the time Lincoln arrives in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration, all the federal property in those 7 states had been confiscated, with 2 exceptions. One was Fort Pickens, a small isolated fort in a remote area of Florida, and the other was Fort Sumter, located in a hotbed of secessionist fever in one of the most important harbors in the United States. Now, 1860 was the beginning of the mass age of communication, thanks to this wondrous new invention called the telegraph. Now, before the telegraph, news would take days, weeks, maybe months to make it into the hands of a newspaper reader. But with the telegraph, updates were instantaneous. And so the public got caught up in this drama in Fort Sumter. People in the 19th century were no different than you and I. What do we do after 9/11, after the Iraq War erupted? We were all gathered around our television set. We wanted every morsel of new information, didn't we? That's what was happening in the country in 1861. Everybody wanted to know what's going to happen with Fort Sumter. What is Lincoln going to do? Is he going to reclaim all the property taken? Is he going to hold Sumter? Is he going to abandon Sumter? What's he going to do? So it was on March 4th, during his inaugural address, Lincoln announces a conciliatory policy. We're going to hold, occupy, and possess the property belonging to the government, ostensibly what we still have. He pledges to be firm on Fort Sumter. He strikes the conciliatory note. We're not going to be provocative. We are not going to attack the South. We're not going to initiate war. If it's going to happen, it's going to come from you. It was a good policy. It was a well-received speech. He had to feel good about it. Because in his mind, I bought us some time, maybe in a few months, when the hotheads in the South cool off, we can get more rational people together and we can talk about reconstructing this country. So, he gets up early in the morning of March 5th in a chipper mood, goes walking around the White House grounds, gets a little bit of exercise, heads in for an early breakfast, sits down, eats a single hard-boiled egg, has a cup of coffee, gulps those down, runs up the stairs, sits in his chair, and at that very instant, a courier walks in with a letter from Major Robert Anderson, commanding officer of Fort Sumter. The letter informs Lincoln that his supplies are running out and he recommends evacuation of the fort. At the bottom of that letter is a note from Lincoln's General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott, hide you can go in the Army, endorsing Anderson's recommendation. Now, history does not record Lincoln's reaction, and he rarely used profanity. but I have to imagine at least some profane words with too. I mean, think about it. He's just pledged to the entire country 2 promises. I'm not going to abandon Fort Sumter, and I'm not going to provoke war with the South. And now he's trapped by a snare of his own device. He had misunderstood the situation at Sumter, and now he's faced with 2 evils. No way out. What's he going to do? Well, Abraham Lincoln did what all great leaders should do when faced with a situation like this. He asked questions. First person he talked to was the General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott. All right, I need to know how long can Anderson's men hold out? Scott does some mental calculations. He said, well, if they go on half rations, they could last 6 weeks, but no more. Lincoln said, all right, I got myself a deadline here. All right, what will it take to reinforce the fort? Scott does some more calculations. It'll take 25,000 men in about 6 months. Wow. The United States Army in 1861 numbered 17,000 soldiers, and most of them were scattered in forts throughout the Western Territory. Lincoln did not have 25,000 men. He did not have 6 months. And this is Lincoln establishing the framework for his decision-making process. That's why those questions are so important, to create the framework by which he's going to make his ultimate decision. Now, he made a key strategic mistake in not understanding Fort Sumter. He's not going to make that mistake again. So he continues to gather information. He does it in some unorthodox ways. He tells his bodyguards to go down to Charleston, sneak in there, do a little poking around, come back here and tell me what you see. Assess the military situation. Called his political opponent, old rival, Stephen Douglas, a former resident of Charleston. He asked Douglas to go to Charleston and figure out the political situation, come back and report to him. He even went so far to ask the wife of one of his officers stationed at Fort Sumter. The officer was Abner Doubleday. Yes, that Abner Doubleday. He asked Abner Doubleday's wife if he could read Doubleday's letters to her, hoping to get some sort of information. Now, within the midst of all this information gathering, one of his cabinet members comes to him, a guy by the name of Montgomery Blair, and he said, I got a guy I want you to talk to. That kind of sounds like a Chicago mobster, doesn't it? I got a guy I want you to talk to. He can make this whole thing go away. I don't think the conversation went like that. Anyway, Montgomery Blair brings in a guy named Gustavus Fox. Fox is a former naval officer, now in the private sector, and he also happens to be grown. Fox has got a great idea. He said, forget the military. We don't need military vessels. We'll charter private vessels. We'll slip into Fort Sumter under the cover of darkness. We'll reinforce that fort. We'll be out of there before the Confederates even know what happened. It was a daring plan, fraught with potential risk, but it gave Lincoln something he desperately needed: hope. So, the next day he gathers his cabinet together, explained Fox's plan, and now having demonstrated the reinforcement of the fort at the least possible, he asked them for their recommendations on whether the fort should be reinforced or not. He got 1 yes, he got 1 maybe, and he got 5 no's. Hardly the ringing endorsement he needed to take broad-based action. But he refused to give in to his cabinet's wishes because he understood the political and symbolic importance of Fort Sumter far more than anyone else in the country did. He refused the pressure on him to make a hasty decision. He created the time he needed to weigh alternatives. And meanwhile, he got a lot of flack for it. Political cartoonists in the paper were picturing him as a clown and had no idea what he was doing. The New York Times editorial blared, wanted a policy. Basically, Mr. President, are you ever going to make a decision here? Lincoln refuses to make a hasty decision until he has all the information at hand. Not going to make a misstep here. It's too important. So, The deadline approaches. Lincoln gathered as much information as he can, and he decided to make the best decision he possibly can under the circumstances. He approved Fox's plan with a minor twist. He only authorizes Fox to provision the fort, not reinforcement. By provision, I mean providing food. With that simple little twist, he turned what was a military operation into a mission of mercy. I mean, come on, we're bringing food to hungry soldiers. Who could be against that? So, Lincoln, with that decision, was able to maintain both of his pledges made during his inauguration. So, he contacts the governor of South Carolina and informs him of his decision. The governor contacts the Confederate government. The Confederate government makes a fateful decision, and on April 12th of 1861, 100 Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter and pummeled the fort for a day and a half. On April 13th of 1861, Major Robert Anderson officially surrendered Fort Sumter, and the American Civil War began. Now, the crisis of Fort Sumter had been a brilliant coup for Lincoln. He had survived a very difficult period of time and made a brilliant decision, but it was not easy. He would later tell his friend Orville Browning, a man from Quincy, Illinois, that the time period between his inauguration and the fall of Sumter was full of troubles so great that could he have anticipated them, he would not have thought it possible to survive them. Let's talk about the leadership principles we can glean from Abraham Lincoln's resolve. First and foremost, when you're faced with a crisis of this nature, resist the pressure to act in haste. The first thing you should do is ask questions to solicit opinions, to develop the framework for your ultimate decision-making process. Most importantly, create the time you need to weigh options. Don't let external pressures force you into a hasty decision. Educate yourself thoroughly on the issue. Take that information, think, and then think some more. And finally, most importantly, identify a deadline. And when that deadline arrives, make the best decision you can with the information you have on hand. That's how you demonstrate resolve. All right, let's move on to the second leadership element, and that is compassion. Now, when I say Abraham Lincoln was a compassionate leader, I'm not looking at him through today's lens. I don't think he was the kind of leader who gave his cabinet members hugs when they were having bad days. No, rather, I think Lincoln's compassion was displayed in three fundamental ways: his humility, his patience, and his humor. Let's talk about each one of those in a little bit more detail. This is a painting showing Lincoln's cabinet, his famously called team of rivals. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by the same title. And that is literally true, because Lincoln's administration, his cabinet, most of the members of that cabinet were his political rivals in the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. Let's talk about a few members of that famous team of rivals. First, you have Salmon Chase. He was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Lincoln's opponent during the 1860 presidential nomination. Chase represented the abolitionist wing of the early fledgling Republican Party. Edwin Bates. Bates was a conservative. He was so conservative, he was technically a Whig. He was Lincoln's Attorney General, also Lincoln's opponent in the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. And Bates hailed from the slave state of Missouri, our neighbor next door. And then at the center of the administration is a moderate, William H. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. Very few men in the history of this country have ever been more qualified to be president than William H. Seward. And as a matter of fact, Seward was everyone's first choice for the Republican nomination for president. But through a weird series of events, That didn't happen. Instead, it was a prairie lawyer from a backwater town in the western state of Illinois. Why would Lincoln appoint his rivals to his cabinet? The reason, from my perspective, is because Lincoln had a deep sense of humility. Let me explain that. When I say Lincoln was humble, I don't mean he was meek. Meekness and humility are two different things. To be meek means perhaps you're lacking in self-confidence, but humility is the very definition of strength. You see, it is only those among us who are supremely self-confident and understand our strengths and weaknesses who can relinquish control to people who can do the job better than we can. Yes, these men were his rivals. Yes, they were difficult to manage, but he needed them. And his humility allowed him to appoint his rival to this cabinet. Well, that's all well and good, John, but how do you manage a group like this? And it's difficult. Keep in mind, when Lincoln faced his cabinet, he was not standing in front of a room full of devoted followers. No, quite to the contrary. He was facing a group of angry, disappointed men who, to a person, believed that each of them was better qualified and better able to be President of the United States than their current Commander-in-Chief. How do you lead a group like that? Well, if you're Abraham Lincoln, you lead by example. That's what all great leaders do. You exemplify the behavior you want to see. Most important with Lincoln was what they called back then magnanimity. The ability to forget slights, to forgive people. And he was famous for that. It's a testimony to his leadership style that this angry group of disappointed men thought they were better than Lincoln. By the end of his administration, they all, to a man, loved him. It was William H. Seward, Lincoln's chief political rival, who would one day say, "The president is the best of us." So, that's how you display humility. How about patience? Lincoln would need a lot of patience when dealing with his generals. And one general stands out among all others. And it's this man named General George B. McClellan. Summer of 1862, Lincoln needs a leader for his army. He's got a ragtag group of volunteers who aren't very well trained, they're not disciplined, and they're not a very good army. Lincoln needs someone to whip them into shape. So he taps this 34-year-old wonder boy, George B. McClellan. Graduated top of his class at West Point, was a hero of the Mexican War. In private life, he rose to the rank of a president of a railroad, all this before age 34. And Lincoln asked him to lead his army. And McClellan is talented. Unfortunately, he is vainglorious, egomaniacal, and really just a pain in the behind. Difficult person to manage. McClellan would write letters to his wife telling how he was the savior of the country and just talking about the baboons in Washington that would not support him. A difficult person to manage. But Lincoln did it with a great deal of patience. I love this picture right here. It's one of my favorites of Abraham Lincoln. What's remarkable about this picture? Anybody have any ideas? Where is Lincoln? Is he in the White House? Where is he? Out in the field with the troops. He did this quite often. Probably spent more time in the field than any previous U.S. president. And it showed. The soldiers loved him. And it made a big difference when dealing with somebody with a huge ego, like George McClellan, even things out between them. Even so, with this patient approach, McClellan was extremely difficult to manage. Another great story. In the fall of 1862, it's not long after McClellan's been appointed, Lincoln, Secretary of State Seward, and one of Lincoln's secretary, a man named John Hay, they're in the White House late at night, talking about the progress of the war. In the conversation, they reach a point where they realize they need some input from General McClellan. So Lincoln said, "Let's go see him." So the three of them walk out the front door of the White House, down the street to Washington to McClellan's house. I know it was a different time. Lincoln knocks on the door. The servant answers the door. He says, "Excuse me, is General McClellan available?" The servant says, "I'm sorry, sir. General McClellan is attending a wedding, but you're welcome to wait for him in the parlor when he returns." So Lincoln, Stewart, and Hay go into the parlor and resume their conversation. A little while later, General McClellan comes home, walks in the front door, walks past the parlor, and starts up the stairs. The servant says, "Excuse me, General, the President, Secretary Stewart are waiting for you in the parlor." McClellan says something to the servant, continues up the stairs. After a while, Lincoln comes out of the parlor and he says, "Excuse me, has General McClellan returned yet?" The servant said, "Sorry, Mr. President, the General wishes me to inform you that he has gone to bed and that you may call upon him in the morning." What does Lincoln do? He says, "Okay." He, Stewart, and Hay walk out the door and head back to the White House. Stewart and Hay are incensed at McClellan's behavior, but Lincoln's response revealed a deep degree of emotional intelligence, the ability to separate emotion from your decision-making process. He simply says, "It's better at this time not to be making points of personal dignity and etiquette." There was another time Lincoln called a meeting between he, McClellan, and the governor of Ohio, this time in the White House. So Lincoln and the governor of Ohio are waiting, and McClellan is late. Matter of fact, he's very late. The governor tells the president that you ought to reprimand McClellan for this behavior. Lincoln says, "Never mind, I will hold McClellan's horse if you will just bring us papers." Why was Lincoln so patient with this man? Because he needed him. Despite his misgivings, McClellan was a brilliant administrator who worked tirelessly to transform that ragtag army into one of the greatest armies this world has ever seen. History really validates Lincoln's management style here. But creating an army and using it, those are two different things. Once Lincoln realized that George B. McClellan is not the right man to lead that army into battle, he doesn't hesitate. He cashiers him immediately. And as a matter of fact, he goes through a series of series of generals, 6 to 9 months at a time. Gives them a chance, they don't perform, he fires them. He continues the iterative process until he finally comes to a soldier named Ulysses S. Grant, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, that's how you demonstrate patience. I love this painting. This is one of my favorites. This is a painting of the most important cabinet meeting in American history. This was the September 22nd, 1862 cabinet meeting where Lincoln announces to his cabinet he is releasing his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. A very serious moment, isn't it? I love looking at the faces of all the cabinet members. They look grim. Salmon Chase is standing beside Lincoln on his left side with his arms crossed, steely, determined look on his face. Secretary of State Stewart is next to him at the table, his hand in his pocket, leaning forward intently. Everybody looks so determined and grim in that picture. Now, if the artist had chosen instead to capture the beginning of that meeting, we'd have a far different picture. Why? Because Abraham Lincoln decided to initiate, or open up, the most important cabinet meeting in the history of this country with a reading from his favorite humorist, a man named Artemus Ward. Lincoln read a humorous story called High-Handed Outrage at Utica, which recalled the travels of a country bumpkin in the metropolitan New York. Cabinet members all thought it was hilarious. Their diaries all reported reaction. One said that Secretary of State Stewart was laughing so hard that he was slapping his knee as tears ran down his face. What a wonderful image. See, Lincoln knew it was going to be a tense meeting, and so he used humor to diffuse the situation before it started. I think a lot of people think of Abraham Lincoln as a joke teller, a storyteller, might just tell you a bawdy story. But what most people don't realize is he used that humor strategically. He used it to diffuse conflict. He used it to make a point in a way that would make you chuckle, but ensure that you understand what he wanted you to do. See, Lincoln understood that humor and optimism can go a long way toward bringing a team together. So let's talk about the leadership principles we can glean from this examination of Lincoln's compassion. First and foremost, most important thing a leader does, lead by example. Exemplify the behavior you want to see in others. Remember to be humble. You can't do it all yourself. You need other people who have strength that you don't to make the job work, to make the project work. Remember to get out of your office and talk to the troops. Don't sit in your ivory tower. Go to them. It equalizes the relationship. It makes it much more harmonious. Focus on ideas, not personalities. And most importantly, develop emotional intelligence, the ability to separate emotion from your decision-making process. And finally, remember, humor and optimism goes a long way toward bringing a team together. All right, we've covered resolve and compassion. Now it's time for my favorite, vision. I think everybody here understands the importance of vision to leadership. But it seems to me that a lot of leaders avoid the topic altogether. And I think it's because they have a misunderstanding of vision. They think it's all up to them. I'm the leader of the organization. It's my job to understand the challenges and threats and opportunities out there. It's my job to consider all that and come up with a vision for our employees to implement. From my way of thinking, that's completely 180 degrees wrong. Because I believe that vision is a collaborative process. And it is the role of the leader to facilitate that process. To talk with all of us, to take pieces of that vision and wield it all together. We're going to talk about how Lincoln was able to use public sentiment in order to build a powerful vision for the Northern War effort. And I think as we do so, I think you'll understand a little bit better how he used that collaborative process. Let's start first by talking about the Northern vision at the beginning of the war. You may be surprised to know that the Northern vision in 1861 had nothing to do with slavery. No, the vision of the North was to save the Union. Why wasn't slavery mentioned? Well, folks, in 1861, the right of the slave owner to own slaves was guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Lincoln despised slavery, but as president, he was powerless to do anything about it. And so, for the initial beginning of the war effort, the concentration was on bringing the Union back together. Slavery and all, despicable as that sounds. Now, in the fall of 1862, Lincoln decides a change is needed. War is not going well, so he decides to push the boundaries of his executive power in order to remove a significant obstacle. And he releases the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is a legal argument that goes something like this. All right, slavery is protected by the United States Constitution. We all understand that. But 11 states of the Union are currently in rebellion against the authority of the United States of America. And the fuel which is driving that rebellion is slave labor. It's the slaves that are working in the field picking the cotton that's used to clothe Southern soldiers. It's the slaves working on the farm producing food to feed the armies. It's the slaves working in the factories creating munitions that are shredding Northern soldiers on battlefields of the war. And so the Emancipation Proclamation says that in order to preserve the Union, we have to address the issue of slavery in these states. What Lincoln's doing is he's showing America that the two goals, The twin goals of abolishing slavery and preserving the Union are not mutually exclusive. They are intertwined. You cannot preserve the Union without addressing this issue of slavery. It's one small step toward a new vision, but it's a significant one. So, he releases that Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. He gives the Southern states 3 months to return to the Union. Of course, they do not. And so on January 1st of 1863, with the stroke of his pen, Abraham Lincoln declared that 3 million slaves are thenceforward, and forever free. Now, 1863 begins to unfold, and the war gets bigger. It gets a lot bigger. The cost of the war climbs in terms of money and of blood. The 3-day Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania claimed 51,000 casualties. 51,000. Americans were starting to grapple with some big questions about this war. Starting to question what's it all about. They're looking for a higher purpose in all of this suffering. Lincoln knows this. Why? Because he's talking to them. Lincoln opened the White House to visitors almost every day of the week. Some days he would see dozens of people. He'd love to do it. Why? Because in 1863, there were no polling firms. There were no exit polls. There was no statistical analysis of voter sentiment. If you wanted to know what the average American was thinking, you had to ask him or her. That's exactly what Lincoln was doing. He called these visits his public opinion bath, and he loved to bathe himself in public opinion. He would ask people what they thought about slavery. What do you think about the Northern War effort? What do you think about the country? He'd take all that information and try to understand public sentiment. And by the end of the summer of 1863, Lincoln begins to realize that a good number of people in the country, probably a majority, are ready for a new vision. By the fall of 1863, he's certain of it. All he needs now is the right opportunity to communicate that vision. That opportunity arrives in the manner of an invitation to speak at the dedication ceremony for a new national cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on November 19th of 1863. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So, Lincoln arrives in Gettysburg. The first speaker of the day is Edward Everett, the Tony Robbins of his day. Everett begins speaking, talking about the war at Gettysburg and why the battle occurred for 2 full hours. Conclusion of his speech, his rhetoric soars, and the audience burst into applause. The children's choir comes out, they sing a quick hymn, and then the President of the United States is introduced. Lincoln steps up to the podium, pulled out a pair of horn-rimmed glasses, pulled the text from his pocket, and began to speak. Now, I'm going to read to you the Gettysburg Address. And don't worry, it won't take a few minutes. And I want you to look at it differently. I think all of us have grown up thinking of this as just a great political speech. I want you to listen to it from the perspective of what I believe it truly is, a vision statement. Lincoln begins, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln takes his audience to the past. He reminds them all of their common beginnings. And most importantly, he reminds them of the ideals by which this nation was founded. That's what great leaders do. Doesn't matter if it's a country or an organization. Take us back to the beginning and remind us the principles upon which we were founded. Lincoln moves on to the present. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Now it's time for Lincoln to answer a very important question. Let me ask you something. If you're in the crowd that day and your husband, your son, your brother lies dead in that cemetery, what's the one question on your mind? Why? That, ladies and gentlemen, is what great leaders do. They answer the question why. And Lincoln does it in stunning fashion. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. 2 minutes, 274 words, and it's over. The audience isn't quite sure what happened. Is he done? The clapping builds up. People were so surprised, Lincoln thought it was a flop initially. But its brevity is its brilliance. Because you see, newspaper editors, rather than comment on such a brief speech, they printed the whole thing. So this message went to everyone in the country. And it became a vision statement for the North that was so effective that soldiers sang it as they marched into battle. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Didn't know I could sing, did you? Well, it wasn't very good, but you get the idea. Imagine how successful your organization would be if your employees marched into work every day singing your organization's vision statement. Food for thought. All right, so Lincoln's got a stunning new vision. Now he needs to implement it. He needs people who can help him achieve that vision. And the choices he makes, they're instructive. I love this painting here. It's called The Peacemakers. The individuals in the painting from the right to the left. On the right is Rear Admiral David Porter. The next person in line is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. Next to Lincoln is General Ulysses S. Grant. And Sherman is on the far left. William Tecumseh Sherman is on the far left of the painting. Now, Sherman and Grant are the pillars of Lincoln's war strategy. They're the two men that are charged with making this vision happen. And both of these two men are extremely troubled. William Tecumseh Sherman had a nervous breakdown at the outset of the war, lost his commission, very nearly got booted out of the army. He had obsessive compulsive disorder. He was definitely a little bit crazy, and he was rabidly racist. But he was one hell of a warrior. Regardless if he was racist or not, he bought into Lincoln's strategy. He knew that slavery needed to be destroyed in order to win this war. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant graduated near the bottom of his class at West Point. He served with some distinction during the Mexican War, but after the war was over, he was stationed in a fort in the Western Territories. He got bored, started drinking. Got him booted out of the army, so he decided to try his hand at business. He failed in spectacular fashion, over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, Grant's fortune plummeted so far that by the outset of the American Civil War, he was working as an assistant clerk in his father's tannery in Galena, Illinois. Boy, did he have a nose for war. Probably one of our greatest soldiers in American history. Lincoln understood this. Lincoln didn't look for somebody that was well-rounded. He understood that change is difficult. I'm going to need people with really significant strengths. Understanding that such people often have glaring weaknesses as well. Lincoln understood the maxim, you staff on strength, you manage your weaknesses. Great story. Lincoln was told rumors that Grant was drinking again. And he said, oh, if I knew his brand of whiskey, I'd send a case to all my other generals. Lincoln's going to need these two men because things get rough. You ever heard the expression, it's going to get worse before it gets better? Well, in 1864, things definitely got worse. Men began dying by the tens of thousands. You see, this stunning new vision came at a cost because it transformed the Civil War into an absolute war of conquest. Savage and cruel. The 2-month period between May 5th of 1864 and July 4th, the two combined armies of the Union suffered 95,000 casualties. It is the largest loss of life in the shortest amount of time in American military history. Bloomington Normal had the population just a shade under 180,000. I want you to imagine over a 2-month period more than half the population disappeared. That's what happened. The war truly became a tragedy at that point. There were small towns in the Northeast who virtually lost their entire population of men between the ages of 18 and 49. You couldn't walk through a street of a town without seeing black cloth draped over a window. Everyone was in mourning, and Americans quickly grew weary of war. They didn't care about the vision anymore. They just wanted it to stop. Oh, by the way, 1864 is an election year. Lincoln's up for re-election, and his war strategy is not popular. He's under tremendous pressure to capitulate on this new vision, to forget about abolishing slavery. The pressure became so great that in August of 1864, he sat down, pulled out his pen, and he wrote 2 letters, proposing terms of peace with the South that did not include the abolition of slavery. Make sure you understand what he's proposing here. He's proposing terms of peace that would require him to renege upon the promise made in the Emancipation Proclamation. Those 3 million slaves that he said were then sent forward and forever free, well, terms of peace happened. They would be rounded up and reinstated. Pretty despicable, huh? Lincoln thought so too, because he never sent those letters. He had a habit of doing that. He liked to get his thoughts down on paper. But you see, Lincoln couldn't send those letters because he had integrated the moral principles of his vision into his decision-making process. There's a great story where Lincoln was talking with a couple of Western politicians who were imploring him to abandon his stand on slavery. Lincoln said, "Gentlemen, I am not a bold man, but I do have the knack of sticking to my promises." Unfortunately for us, he stuck to his promises, regardless of what the election results were. Fortunately, that war strategy finally bore fruit in September of 1864. Sherman captured the southern city of Atlanta, and it was a boost, a small boost, but it was just enough to bolster Northern morale enough to get Lincoln reelected so he could continue to pursue that vision. All right, let's talk about what leadership principles we can learn from Lincoln's vision. First and foremost, and most importantly, remember that vision is a collaborative process, and your job as a leader is to facilitate that vision, that process. It's not your job to figure it all out. It's your job to involve as many people as possible in the vision and help shape it based on the input you get from them. When you're doing so, it's important to test boundaries and remove barriers. Remember, when it's time to communicate that vision, remember that words are important and choose them wisely. Abraham Lincoln used 274 words delivered in under 2 minutes to move a nation. With that in mind, do you really need 2 hours and 50 PowerPoint slides to communicate a new vision to your employees? Take my word for it, folks. Less is more when it comes to vision. Find people that can implement that vision, and when you do, staff on strength, manage weaknesses. And finally, remember to integrate the principles of the vision into your decision-making process. If you communicate a vision and you do not support it, it ain't going to happen. Every action you take has a consequence. Nothing is neutral. It either helps the vision or it hinders the vision. Nothing is neutral. All right. So that's the 3 elements of Abraham Lincoln's leadership style. Those are the leadership principles that we have learned. Lincoln's got one more lesson for all of you, and it's an important one. I'm going to show you a couple photographs here. This one right here was taken of Lincoln right before his inauguration. He looks powerful in that picture, doesn't he? A man in the prime of his life, ready to face whatever challenges life can throw at him. That picture was taken 4 years later, just a few weeks before his death. You can see the wear and tear on his face. And so the last lesson that Lincoln has for us is important. Leadership is about sacrifice. I listened to a podcast a while back with leadership expert Warren Bennis. Bennis has been an advisor to U.S. presidents. He has coached Fortune 500 executives. I mean, he's done everything you can imagine on the subject of leadership. Bennis is now in his golden years. He's in his 80s, and he's gradually retiring. But on this podcast, the interviewer asked him, he said, over the course of your lifetime, all the lessons you've learned, what's the one thing you would say to a new leader? And Bennis had this to say. He said, I would say to a new leader, do you realize, becoming a leader, do you realize the sacrifice and redemptive energy that will be required of you in the event that the organization faces a major crisis? Do you understand what will be required of you at that time? We said it before, that when you become a leader, you begin training. Because one day, you're going to be asked to guide a group of people through the valley of the shadow of death. When that happens, you need to understand the cost, and you need to be prepared. So, take this opportunity to use history to study the great leaders of the past. Use this opportunity to study Lincoln's leadership legacy and improve your performance as a leader and prepare for that crisis. Now, just real quickly, if I've piqued your interest in Abraham Lincoln and you want to learn a little bit more, I have some suggestions for further reading. First and foremost, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. The author is Doris Kearns Goodwin. It was published by Simon & Schuster. It's a great read, very interesting. Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief, written by James McPherson, published by Penguin Books. And finally, if you want to know about Abraham Lincoln, the entire life of Abraham Lincoln, from his beginnings to his presidency, I'd recommend Abraham Lincoln Alive, written by Michael Burlingame, an author who actually lives in Springfield, Illinois. It was published by Johns Hopkins University. It's widely acknowledged as the best source on Abraham Lincoln. All right, now I know I've run a bit long. I think we probably have time for a few questions. But if you have questions, we don't have time for them, I promise I'll wait here and I'll answer any questions you have, no matter how long it takes. All right?